They're going to turn me up now. Well, you didn't get my playlist tonight. We're very fortunate on these ships that none of us, musicians, comedians, singers, do you all like Paul Fredericks the other night? He's an old friend of ours. Without people like him, none of us would be able to work without the guys in the box back there. So for the last half an hour, they've been working the system out to make sure that everything came through. Robert's out there. Desil is out there. Joe and Adrian. Adrian particularly tonight is doing it for me. Thanks very much, guys, because without your help, we'd be nowhere. Tirpitz, a fleeting being. Now, let's just first of all explain what a fleeting being means. A fleet, by definition, is a lot of ships. One ship is, by definition, one ship. If that one ship is big enough and powerful enough, stick it anywhere in the world, and it's a danger sufficient for an enemy to believe it's a fleet. So a fleeting being is what the Tirpitz was for most of its life. It never did a great deal, and I'll be talking about what it did, but it caused us, the Allies, a tremendous amount of problem. But why are we talking about it as we leave Amsterdam? We're talking about it because we're going to now approach where it was born, Wilhelmshaven, where it was built, its home, which was Kiel, and of course the canal that we're going to go through tomorrow was specifically built to allow the Germans to pass their ships from one side of their country to the safe waters of the Baltic without having to go round Denmark and be vulnerable to the British. So that's why that canal exists that we're going through tomorrow. So its home was Kiel, and its hiding place was Norway. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about Norway. We're not visiting Norway, but we're getting pretty close. And we're going to be visiting Scandinavia, and the story of Norway is the story of Scandinavia. So let's start with the Tirpitz. Its keel wasn't, it was part of the Scharnhorst class of ship. So in my previous talks, I've spoken about Bismarck, the Scharnhorst, and this is the third in that class of ship. And as I explained to you before, the Germans were constrained in a 1920 treaty to not having submarines at all. So I've talked about the submarines they had regardless. And they were restricted in the number of surface ships they had and the size of surface ships they had. So initially, they had what we call pocket battleships. We called them pocket battleships because they were just within the measurements that were laid down by the 1920 treaty. But when Hitler came to power, secretly they started to build super ships. And what you end up is you end up with something like, if you take the British aviation history of jet airliners, we were the first to have a jet airliner, the de Havilland Comet. It had a few problems, so Boeing came along with the Boeing 707, yeah? And that was the most successful early jet airliner. Same with these German battleships. Because they were late in coming, they were the absolute cutting edge of battleship design of their time. And you could see that in the picture of the ship. Here's the great fanfare of its launch day on the 1st of April 1939. It's named after von Tirpitz, who was the designer of the modern German Navy. That's how it got its name. And here she is. She's a big ship, very beautiful, as they had wonderful lines, the German battleships. Ours were very square. The US Navy had more modern battleships, and they looked nicer, but ours was something out of the 1920s and 30s. Every bit as effective, but not as pretty. She weighed 52,000 tons. This ship, according to its publicity material, weighs 47,800 tons. So she was a little bit heavier than us. Her length was 792 feet. Ours is 745 feet on this ship. Her beam was 118, and the Tirpitz was 94.5 feet, so she was wider. Part of the width was to do with the 18-inch armoured belt that was round her. We don't need an armoured belt, but she had an 18-inch armoured belt to stop torpedoes and things around her. She had she had a crew of 103 officers and 1,962 men. Those of you who came to my first talk when I was talking about Admiral Cochrane, I talked to you about the difference between civilian ships and fighting ships and how you needed a relatively small number of people to sail a ship, but you needed a massive number of people to fight a ship. And this is the difference. If you have a cruise liner like this, with the sort of service that we're used to having, then you have 930 passengers and 465 crew. So there's a similarity, but they had a lot more people. They did not have a couple of swimming pools. They did have probably a good shower system, and they probably had pretty good ablutions and so on. It was a very modern ship. But they would have had good enrichment lectures. I can guarantee you that. They certainly would have a lot of performances as well. Because when I talk to you about the French versus the French and Spanish versus the British during the Peninsular War and the wars against Spain and France, I talked to you about the Royal Navy being extremely effective, the morale being extremely high, because our seamen were at sea all the time, blockading French and Spanish ports for 6 months at a time, so they were constantly being exercised. The Royal Navy and the US Navy in the Second World War was exactly like that. The German Navy capital ships, they spent so much time in port that they had the same problem that the French and the Spanish had before. They got bored, so they had to have lots of entertainment and be exercised on a great rate. Early days, she was obviously, as I said, based in Kiel. Went out through the Kiel Canal to train in the Baltic, as all the Kriegsmarine ships and U-boats did. The Baltic was their training area. Even though you would expect that the Soviet Union would have some control, or the Finns and the Swedes have some control over the Baltic, it wasn't the case. Right up until almost the end of the war, which I'll be talking about tomorrow, the Soviet Union had very little control of the Baltic. It was the Germans' sea during the Second World War. And of course, they carried out all sorts of secret trials and things there as well. It blockaded the Baltic for a short period. In October, it was still being trained. But these capital ships, the fleet in being, they were such a danger to us that we were constantly looking out for them, sending reconnaissance aircraft to look for them, and then sending bombers to bomb them. So the Tirpitz was being, as all the German capital ships, and indeed the U-boats in France, which is why they built those huge shelters for them, were constantly under bombing from the Allies. Initially the Royal Air Force, and then later the United States 8th and 9th Army Air Force, the submarines. Day and night they were being bombed. So they were continually being sought and attacked by bombers, but a ship is actually quite difficult to hit. And constantly new things were being invented to make it more likely that we would be able to hit a ship with an aircraft. She left Wilhelmshaven for Trondheim on the 14th of January 1942. The reason for that was that Germany had invaded the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, on Sunday the 22nd of June 1941. That was the largest military operation in history, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The result of it was 26 million Soviet citizens were killed. 26 million. You may not have known that. 1,710 towns and 70,000 villages were razed to the ground during the invasion of the Soviet Union. So the Tirpitz is being moved not only because in my previous talk I talked about the Channel Dash, the way they got the German battleships away from France and up to Germany because they weren't safe on the surface in France. For exactly the same reasons, they were moved north, and they were moved to go to Norway because in 1940 Germany had invaded Norway, and now they'd invaded the Soviet Union. And Adolf Hitler called Norway the zone of destiny. He believed that the whole of Scandinavia and Norway particularly would determine the success or failure of the German nation in the Second World War. The reason for that was it was a huge resource for Germany. It had iron ore, molybdenum, iron pyrites, nickel, all the stuff that they needed to turn into weapons in Germany were available from Sweden or Norway via the coast of Norway. And it was hugely important for them to be able to move that stuff to Germany safely. And at the same time, their enemy, their new enemy, the one that they'd had a non-aggression pact with throughout the early parts of the war, their new enemy, the Soviet Union, they knew would be supplied by their two new enemies, the United Kingdom and the United States of America. After the fall of Pearl Harbor, they stupidly, I don't understand why Hitler did it, he declared war on the United States. What a crazy thing to do. But he did. That meant that he knew that the whole might of the United States and the United Kingdom was going to be lent to the Soviet Union in order that they could fight the Germans as well as us. So that material would have to go up through the North Sea and up through the Arctic to the Arctic ports of Murmansk and Archangel into the Soviet Union. So moving his capital ships up there was his strategy for dealing with it, because they might be more effective in those waters than the U-boats which were needed in the Atlantic. Let's have a little look at the area that Germany had occupied by the time the Tirpitz was moved. We got very nearly to a position where the whole world was threatened by this apocalyptic regime. Just look at that part of Europe covered in blue that is on the side of the National Socialists. And the red bit on either side, the Soviet Union on one side, United Kingdom, and of course we'd invaded Iceland, and the United States took over a fair amount of that, were the only free bits in Europe left. And after the fall of France, Germany controlled all that from the North Cape right the way down to France. And of course, with the tie-up that they had with Franco, as I said in my submarine talk, Spain wasn't really that neutral. There were ports in Spain that were very welcome to the Kriegsmarine. The coastline of Norway alone is 2,100 miles. But if you take the leads, which are the bits in between the islands and the actual mainland, it's 16,500 miles, half the circumference of the globe. So an awful lot of area to both defend, but also, more importantly, from the Allies' point of view, a vast area to attack, to find the hidden ships and to attack them. It was called the Golden Route by the Swedish captains who used to sail it, because they used to get a premium for sailing those seas down to Germany with the cargoes that Germany needed, those iron ores that I talked about earlier. So the Soviet Union's invaded, and support for the new ally demands these Arctic convoys. And the Battle of the Atlantic is at that time causing a great deal of concern, in the sense that it's blockading the UK, but it's also blockading the Soviet Union. So these capital ships of the Kriegsmarine, although they became few in number as we started to sink them, were extremely effective. And even if they didn't do anything, they still represented such a danger that we had to hive off sizable chunks of our Royal Navy and the United States Navy to guard the merchant ships in case they came out and attacked them. And as I spoke about a couple of days ago, the Channel Dash moved them, and the Arctic convoys were at great risk. So the Tirpitz is moved north. There are a significant number of photographs of her at various berths in various fjords, and the fjords I'll show you in a moment. But this is a typical picture. Just like you to spare a thought for a moment for the single pilot who would fly an unarmed Spitfire, usually high altitude Spitfire for 8 hours from England to try and find a ship that was going to shoot at him in a field and then get low enough in order to take a photograph like this so that we knew what the defences were around the ship. And reconnaissance pilots very rarely get any credit at all. Fighter pilots are the ones that get all the credit. Somebody once said, the only difference between a fighter pilot and God is God doesn't think he's a fighter pilot. Reconnaissance pilots were every bit as brave. They had cameras as their weapons. And some of the photographs that they took during the Second World War are absolutely incredible. And the risks that they took to take them. And we look at them now, like a photograph like this, and we think, oh yeah, that's nice. It's a picture of the Tirpitz. And look, it's being resupplied by a few boats around it. It's got some camouflage nets, and there are some smoke pots and all that. So isn't that great? We can see all that in that clear photograph. Can you imagine the difficulty that pilot had getting there, getting down there, getting the photograph, getting out without being killed, and then getting all the way 700 miles across the sea back to his base in England for it to be developed. So spare a thought for the reconnaissance pilots. Nobody else does. So the beast is in her lair. It's hiding in Flattened Fjord near Trondheim, and she is a fleeting being. Just by being there, we have to devote a complete, well, 2 fleets actually, out of northern Scotland on rotation in and out of the Arctic in order to make sure our convoys are protected. These are the various places that she hid in, because fjords are wonderful. And if you do, any of you done a Norwegian fjord trip? They are just beautiful, those fjords. They have severe sides, 1,500 feet high, and ships would shelter in them, and it was extremely difficult to attack them. And the Germans knew this, so they would put their ships in the fields and they would be protected there. So she anchors in the field in 1942 in January, and it's just around the corner from Trondheim. You can visit where she used to anchor to this day. It was quite a distance from Trondheim, but then we started to, after these reconnaissance photographs, a series of attacks were made against her in order to try and sink her. The first one was by RAF bombers, and we didn't have very effective weapons. We invented a JW mine, they called it, so that all the pilots called a Johnny Walker mine after the whiskey. It was basically a barrel filled with oil, the first one we tried on them. They would drop it somewhere near the fjord, and it would hopefully roll down and go under the ship and blow up. Never worked, but we tried it anyway. This is a very rare colour photograph of her taken by a Norwegian secret agent. And what you can see on this photograph is her camouflage. If you look towards the bow, you will see a dark colour, which is a replica of her real bow. And if you look towards the stern, there's a replica curve of her real stern. So if you've got a pair of binoculars on a couple of miles distance, if the weather is right, all you'll see is this relatively short ship, and you'll mistake her for something much smaller. It's only when she starts firing at you, you'll realise it's the Tirpitz, because the camouflage makes the ship look smaller. I hope you can see that in that colour photograph. Just behind the tug at the back is where her false stern is, and then you can see the false bow about halfway back from the anchor on the front there. In colour it shows up quite well. And this is how they camouflaged her. In the winter of 1942, she was camouflaged constantly. They moved her constantly. All around the field there were anti-aircraft guns, there were smoke pots, and any time any Allied aircraft came, they would set off the smoke generators and they would cover the whole field in fog. They had radar set up all around, so they had early warning. So we never really knew where she was at any one time. She was constantly being attacked, and she was moved north. There she is under sail on one of her training missions. She was such a threat that on one particular occasion, in June and July 1942, which has become in the annals of maritime history one of the darkest things that happened, an Arctic convoy called PQ-17 was on its way to Murmansk, and we thought that the Tirpitz and the Scharnhorst and a couple of other ships that were up with her had come out and were going to attack it. And we were so convinced of this that the Admiralty in London gave the convoy the order to scatter, which was the worst possible thing that could have been done. And the ships did scatter, and only 11 ships out of the 35 made it to Murmansk. They were all sunk, primarily by aircraft and by a few by submarines. One very, I mustn't stray too far, but one very clever captain got 3 ships together with him, and he sailed up north of Bear Island and and talked to the other captains and said, "Get the white paint out and paint the ships white, and we'll go and hide in the ice cap." And they did that for 2 months. And they sat in the ice, and everybody forgot that this convoy had been there. Then they started to sail towards Murmansk, and they eventually made it. But the conditions for those Arctic convoys were horrendous. The bottom photograph shows you just a small example of what the ice must have been like. And those Arctic convoy merchant seamen in the UK only got recognition 3 years ago by our government, which is disgraceful. But the whole scattering order, regrettably, the admiral that gave it, Admiral Pound, it wasn't known at the time, but he was suffering from a very serious terminal brain tumour. So his decision-making was not of the best. But the United States had recently joined in defence of the Arctic convoys, and Admiral Galley of the United States Navy termed what happened to PQ-17 a shameful page in naval history. So we've got these capital ships. The Bismarck is already sunk, but it managed to sink HMS Hood. The Scharnhorst, I told you all about her and her coterie of ships going north in the Channel Dash a couple of days ago, and the Tirpitz, a fleet in being. What we never seem to calculate is what is on the right there, the real secret. They were never going to be much use at anything, actually. They didn't have the resources to keep them going, which was why they sat in fjords for month after month and very rarely came out to sea. And it was why they weren't supported by the High Command. They needed 200,000 tons of oil every month. And in 1942 alone, they only had 84,000 tons. So they were short 116,000 tons a month. They couldn't go anywhere. They had reserves of 410,000 tons, which was enough for them to operate for 4 months. Well, we're only in 1942, so that, unless they get the Caucasus in Russia and the Romanian fields and the battle in Africa with Rommel, if they had come round and got into the Middle East and got those oil resources, then they may have had a chance. But as long as we stopped them from getting natural oil resources, this was the condition that they were in. So one of the many reasons that Hitler invaded the Soviet Union was to get their natural resources. In fact, every country he invaded, he took their natural resources, from their works of art to their treasury to their oil, gas, steel, whatever it was. And as I've said to you before, he didn't intend to go to war until 1945. He had no strategic vision, so he had no aircraft carriers. So we didn't know all this, or we hadn't worked all this out. And of course, the possibility of them getting the Caucasus, the possibility of them getting through North Africa was still real. So they may have got that oil. So we have mounted all sorts of raids to try and sink these capital ships, particularly the Tirpitz. The Italians had invented what they called chariots, 2-man torpedoes, underwater torpedoes. And this is a photograph of a British copy of the Italians are very, very good at this sort of thing. This is a copy of a photograph of a copy of the chariot that the Royal Navy used, loaded onto. Some of you may have come to my talk when the weather was too bad for the musicians to perform, and I stood up here holding on to this lectern while the ship was going all over the place. And I did an extra talk about the heroes of Telemark. And I talked about what was called the Shetland bus. The Shetland bus was a regular service of trawlers that had been not captured, had gone from Norway to Scotland, and then were operated to operate clandestine agent missions and what have you from Scotland to Norway. These are being loaded onto one of the Shetland buses, a trawler called Arthur. They were small trawlers brought over from Norway. And one of the captains who was most famous is Leif Larsen. And I put him up up here because his trawler, Arthur, carried these 2 chariots, human torpedoes, across the North Sea to attack the Tirpitz. And there is the trawler on the left there. See how small it is? Leif Larsen was the most decorated Allied British / Norwegian officer of the Second World War. You have Audie Murphy in the United States, the most decorated United States serviceman. On our side of the Atlantic, Leif Larsen was the most decorated. I can't go through all the medals that he got because there are too many, and some of them he got up to 3 of them of each type. So he was the captain. The idea was to put them on the trawler, underneath the trawler, and tow them across with the crew hidden in the depths of the trawler where the fish would normally be stored. They had terrible weather. This is what they look like, the chariots. The front end of that chariot is the bomb load, and the frogmen that sit on it, very dangerous job. Their operation was to go under the Tirpitz, release that weapon underneath the hull, and then swim away. Pretty much a suicide mission. Regrettably, the weather was so bad that all sorts of things happened to them, and the 2 chariots were never used. They never got to the Tirpitz. The Tirpitz only went out on any operational mission once, and that was in September 1942 when she went to Spitsbergen to help the bombardment of the Allied weather station and radio station that was there. That's the only time that her guns and she operated in a hostile way against the Allies. The next one was in between. We're trying to bomb the Tirpitz on a regular basis, and I'll show you the results of that at the very end. But every arm of the services, the Navy, the Army, the agents in Norway, and the Royal Air Force, and the United States 8th Air Force, all had a go at this ship. But the midget submarines...
During 1943, the Royal Navy developed a midget submarine known as the X-Craft. Carried 2 detachable side charges, each containing 2 tons of high explosives. These would be placed under the target. A time fuse would then detonate the charges after the X-Craft got away. The crews of 6 X-Craft spent many months training in a remote Scottish sea loch for a raid on the Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, and the heavy cruiser Lutzow.
Very, very brave men. In order to get those 6 midget submarines across the North Sea, they had what they called transit crews. 3 men in the crew. So they had the 3 men that were going to do the actual attack, and they had a transit crew to sail under tow behind a submarine across the North Atlantic. 2 of them broke away and were never seen again on the way across. So the transit crews were lost. In the actual attack, only 2 of them managed, because the Tirpitz was surrounded by booms and nets, and they thought that the nets only went down to a certain depth. When the X-Craft the 2 successful X-Craft got to the boom, they discovered that it went right the way down to the bottom of the field. They were very, very lucky. They looked through their periscope and they saw a destroyer going in and the boom being opened for it. So they scuttled in after it. But both of them were seen by crews on the Tirpitz. They broached a couple of times. But either way, one of the X-Craft did plant its charges under the Tirpitz. The crew were then captured and brought aboard the Tirpitz. So they're on the Tirpitz when the explosion happened. We thought that it had been an unsuccessful mission, so we carried on with our plans to try and destroy the battleship. In fact, the X-craft had caused significant damage to the ship. We didn't know that, but they couldn't take the ship anywhere to repair it because there was nowhere big enough for it to go into dry dock. The original place it was meant to dry dock was down in Saint-Nazaire in France. But we had already blown up the Saint-Nazaire dry dock was constructed for the SS Normandy, the wonderful, great, huge transatlantic blue ribbon liner. Massive. That would have taken ships like the Tirpitz and the Scharnhorst. We knew that, so we sent a bunch of commandos in and we blew it up. So they no longer had any facilities to dry dock the ship, and it was dangerous to move it out of the field. So they actually managed to repair it in situ. But we didn't know that they hadn't repaired it perfectly. But it was one of the greatest maritime engineering feats, because they brought engineers and ships and whatever to make significant repairs that had been done as a result of the damage that had been done by the X-craft to the ship. But we didn't know this, so we kept on sending aircraft in. And the Royal Navy decided that they would send in aircraft from aircraft carriers. So Operation Tungsten, I talked about code names at the previous talk and how they sometimes give away what was actually going to happen. In this case, it didn't. April to July 1944, aircraft carriers off the coast of Norway sent aircraft after aircraft in to attack the Tirpitz. Very few successful hits. This is one of the photo reconnaissance photographs, because the poor old photo recce chap, every time there was a raid on anything, whether it was a city, a target, a ship, or whatever, they would always have to go and confirm or deny whether we had done well or done badly. Each bombing aircraft had cameras in the bomb bay. So when the bomb aimer pressed the button for the bombs to go, even at night, one of the bombs would have been a flare, and it would have illuminated the target, and a camera shot would have been taken of where they hit. And that was for the intelligence people back at home to A, determine whether the raid was effective, and B, determine whether the crew were credited with a mission or not. Because unless they came back with in the case of the Royal Air Force, unless they came back with a successful photograph, it wasn't counted towards the tour of missions that they had completed. The same with the Tirpitz. This sort of photograph would have been taken by a reconnaissance aircraft, and as you can see, the smoke has already started to be generated around the ship, and by the time the rest of the aircraft come in, the ship would be completely covered. So the operations by the Fleet Air Arm in April and July 1944 were not particularly successful. Again, in July and August 1944, they did manage to hit a couple of times, and the damage is visible in these shots. But it wasn't, we didn't have this is a German photograph. The reconnaissance didn't show this sort of damage. So the ship was massive, it still looked in pretty good order. They were still defending it just as heavily as they'd defended it before. So we knew that we needed to sink the ship if we were going to be successful in stopping this fleet in being upsetting our plans and diverting very serious resources that we really wanted to pass on to the Pacific War, which was going badly at that time. So Operation Paravane was an attempt. By this time, they'd moved Tirpitz right up north of the Arctic Circle to Altafield, right up near the North Cape, up near Kyafield and Altafield, very far north, out of range of our bomber aircraft. So Operation Paravane was a very, very adventurous episode for the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command, and we used a special squadron called 617 Squadron, who some of you may know were the people who dropped the dam-busting bomb that bounced and broke the Mona Dam and the Ada Dam in 1943. That squadron had become a specialist squadron. 617 and 9 Squadron had become specialist squadrons at very accurate bombing with new secret weapons. So what we did was we decided, and they were also very good at navigation. They had the best crews, the cream of the crews. They'd all done at least 25 sorties, 30 sorties. Some of them were on their third tour, so they'd done more than 60 missions. So they were expert crews. So we sent them to Russia, to land in Russia, and then to attack the Tirpitz from Sweden, a neutral country. We didn't sell the Swedes. We sent them to Russia, and we thought, well, if we attack from Sweden, the Tirpitz won't be ready, and therefore they had fighter cover from a local air base and all sorts of things. We'll be successful. Unfortunately, this shot shows you that the first aircraft over there, the smoke generators, you could see them working, and the ship is not visible. So they bombed the ship. By then the weapon was extremely expensive as well, so if they couldn't actually hit the ship, they were told to bring the weapon home. So in the case of Paravane, they failed. But the Germans moved the ship. They moved her to Tromsø. They moved her further south. And by doing that, they made her vulnerable to aircraft that were coming from England again. So 617 and 9 Squadron set off on the 12th of November 1944 on an operation called Catechism. And when they got there, they found the weather was glorious. And they'd only just moved the ship there, and they hadn't yet set up all the smoke generators and all the defenses that she usually had around her. Worse than that, the local fighter base had got the wrong frequencies, and the telephone lines hadn't been laid. So the fighter base was not told that the aircraft were coming in, so they didn't take off to protect the Tirpitz and shoot down the British bombers. And the bomber pilots were very surprised when they found there was no fighter cover, and the weather was glorious, and they could see the ship. And they were carrying a relatively new bomb called a tall boy. A couple of weeks ago in the papers, we had the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan. You read about that? MOAB. That's not what it's really called, but the journalists like to call it the mother of all bombs. Very similar weapon, very similar weight, very similar purpose. They call it an airburst bomb, the MOAB. In actual fact, I don't know how they did the tunnels in Afghanistan by airbursting. I suspect that they could also had the capability that the Royal Air Force's tall boy had, which was to go supersonic, bury itself deep in the ground, go bang, and set up an earthquake effect. And that's how they attacked the Tirpitz on the 12th of November 1944. And here, I'm going to show you a good old friend of mine who sadly died last year, Tony Iverson, who was one of the 617 Squadron pilots being interviewed about what it was like to attack the Tirpitz. Tony Iverson is unique. He was a Battle of Britain fighter pilot in 1940, and he was a 617 elite bomber pilot in 1944.
Suddenly I was conscious of seeing great big orange clouds going off and realized that they were firing big guns at us.
The bomber planes came from the back of the fjord. When the artillery shot the first salvo, the grenades exploded under the plane formation.
Oh, we soon got beyond range of those. And I think we saw her down there lying black. There were no smoke generators there. There were no mountains close enough. And it became almost like a practice bombing run. We were heading right down the line. And Frank was saying, "This is great, Skip, great, 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 hold it, hold it, hold it." Then came the red light. And then down went Tall Boy.
The bomb flew for a while with the plane. Then it looked smaller, and you saw it flying towards you. I guess then it became too fast because you couldn't see it anymore.
I've watched smaller bombs, even one-ton bombs fall, and they seem to roll over before they settle down. Not the Tall Boy, that went. Just as if you'd fired an arrow, absolutely dead straight. And the Tall Boy went through the speed of sound before it hit the target. Nothing could have stood at that. no matter how powerful the battleship was, how armored it was, no, it was doomed to be destroyed.
And these are the hits on the Tirpitz. I'll talk in a moment about who claimed to be the squadron. There were two squadrons and who claimed to have sunk it. But as you can see, they were pretty accurate. Funnily enough, the number 3 there, if ever you go, that's the crater. Here is the crater. It's still there. You can walk into it. It's quite large. And the ship, as you can see, is in the background. I walked through that crater about 2 years ago. The Tirpitz was, it turned turtle, and they lost between 950 and 1,204 men. They tried their darndest to get them out, but that 18-inch thick armour belt around made it extremely difficult for them to arc weld their way, cut their way through. They rescued 82 men, but the rest of them, I'm afraid, died. But it doesn't end there, because these two squadrons, 617 and 9 Squadron, still exist in the Royal Air Force. And since the Second World War, they had this huge rivalry about who actually dropped the bomb that sank the Tirpitz. And they were given, when the Tirpitz was eventually broken up for salvage and for its steel and everything, and removed, this is one of the bulkheads out of the Tirpitz. I think it probably was somewhere around the propeller shaft, if you look at the bottom of it. And it has a motif against England on the top, which was painted on by the sailors at the time. Anyway, this was brought up by the divers that were salvaging it, and it was given to the Royal Air Force as a trophy for sinking the Tirpitz. So 617 Squadron got hold of it because they said they'd sunk the Tirpitz, and 9 Squadron said, but it's ours. We sank the Tirpitz. And for the next 30 years, these two squadrons kept on stealing this trophy from each other's crew room. And the thefts got so serious and so expensive. For example, after it had been stolen from 9 Squadron, 617 Squadron were based in England at Scampton in Lincolnshire. And what they did to stop it being stolen, they cemented it into the floor of their crew room and put an armoured glass cover over it so it could be walked over, and it was cemented in. 9 Squadron were at Cyprus with Vulcan bombers, the big V bomber, jet bomber, atomic bomber. They put on a clandestine mission to England from Cyprus, landing at a totally different air base than where 617 Squadron was based. They didn't want them to be suspicious or anything. And in the middle of the night, they landed at Scampton without permission with 1 aircraft and a truck. They'd driven a truck there from the place that they were at. And they blew out the bulkhead from its concrete using explosives in the crew room and loaded it into the truck, put it in the bomb bay of their Vulcan, and flew back to Cyprus with it. Well, the air marshals, the generals and everybody, they said, that's it. We've had enough now. There's no more of this. It cost us a huge amount. You said you were on exercise. You were actually stealing the trophy again. So they said, you must give it to the Royal Air Force Museum. I was the Director General. And they will look after it for you. And then both squadrons can have reunions at the museum, and you can both stand in front of the trophy and claim that you hit the Tirpitz. And I was, of course, in charge of the ceremony when it was handed to the museum. And I stood next to the 2 squadron commanders, trying to separate them from getting at each other's throats. And in my sort of speech of thanks, I said, I'm still not convinced that what you've given me isn't a facsimile, and one of you has really got the original bolted into your crew room somewhere. But we did check it out, so it's now at the RAF Museum. So is this aircraft. This is the last Halifax bomber left in the world. And this aircraft I recovered in the middle 1970s from a fjord in Norway. It had attacked the Tirpitz with one of those Johnny Walker mines with oil in it in 1942. And it had been shot up in the starboard outer engine on the right-hand side there. And it had a Canadian captain, a New Zealand rear gunner, an Australian wireless operator, a British engineer, and a British bomb aimer. So a typical Royal Air Force crew from all over the Commonwealth. The pilot, in the middle of the night, engine on fire, is not coming home, sees a frozen lake in front of him, tells all his chaps to get into the brace position, and he belly lands that aircraft on the frozen lake. All of them get out. The escape hatches are on the top of the fuselage. They all get out. It slides along the lake and comes to a halt with the engine still burning. They get out of the top in the middle of the night. The flight engineer breaks his ankle as he jumps off the wing route onto the ice. So he can't walk. So they take him to a nearby Norwegian house, and the family in the house say they will look after him and give him up to the Germans in a couple of days so he can have treatment. Rest of the crew all trekked out into Sweden. They were all repatriated. They all carried on flying in Bomber Command. And in 1982, we opened a special building, which is this building here. That's a nuclear bomber in the background and the Halifax in the front there. And I was the director, and we had Queen Mother, who was alive then, came and opened the building. And in front of that aeroplane, we had the whole crew, 1982. They hadn't seen each other since they'd run away from the aeroplane and left their flight engineer in 1942 in the middle of the night. They'd all gone off in different directions, and they'd all got home. We brought them from all over the world, and they all stood in front of their aeroplane, and the Queen Mother said, "Well done, chaps." And that was one of the many attempts, the human element of the attempt to try and sink the Tirpitz, a fleet in being. Hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you very much.